Hello, everyone. It's absolutely wonderful to be joining you today to have a very interesting conversation. It's been exactly 24 hours since we just concluded the third intergovernmental negotiation sessions for a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. And I'm joined with very interesting people, courtesy of the East African Tax Governance Network. And we're about to have an interesting debrief as well about this entire process, what the journey towards global tax governance looks like, and what we really hope out of this entire process. I'll begin by quick introductions before proceeding to introduce the rest of the people in this particular panel. My name is Lurit Yugusuk, and I am a policy analyst who heavily focuses on policy communications and advocacy design to ensure that civic participation and public participation in different processes is well informed and in a manner that people are able to understand it as simplified as possible. I'll give it to Riva to begin us with a quick introduction.
Sure. Thanks, Lorit. My name is Riva Halipa. I am the researcher and advisor on taxation and human rights with Amnesty International, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks, Lorit.
Thanks, Riva. Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Lurit. I am Hereza Alan, the team lead at Youth for Tax Justice Network, but I'm also the regional focal point for the FFD Youth and Children's constituency within the UN Major Group for Children and Youth. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Glad to be in Nairobi.
You. Thank you, Alan. We'll move on to Kwesi.
Hi, I'm Kwesi Obin. I'm with Oxfam in Africa. I lead our work on accountable and inclusive governance. I'm based in Accra, Ghana. Happy to be here as well, back home, literally.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for those introductions. And I just want us to get into this conversation by grounding the conversation on global tax governance. Where exactly have we come from? Where are we headed? Why are we here? Why does this process matter? And I think we can begin with you, Kwesi. And really, what does international tax cooperation mean in the first place? Why are we even here?
Well, I mean, to start off, for almost a century, the international community have tried to kind of develop a framework that would allow us to be able to essentially distribute the tax revenues around the world properly or fairly. This was started way back by the League of Nations. We've transitioned, and post the Second World War, essentially the Allied forces, those that were on the winning side, came out with a framework dominated by essentially the West, Europe and North America, essentially, designed a framework that essentially prioritizes their needs and their interests over the rest of the world, particularly the global south. And remember, before the end of the Second World War, most of the countries, especially in Africa, were still under colonial governance. And so we were basically not part of the conversations. Now we've transitioned. It's been over almost 80 years. We've transitioned. The world has changed. The world economy has changed dramatically. And yet, those systems have not changed. And so in the new century, essentially, given also the fact that actually the population of the global south at several times more than the global north. And yet when you flip the global tax rules, it gives more than the fair share of northern economies, essentially developed economies. And so there ought to be a change to reflect both the economic activities that are taking place in the global south as well as in the north. And then also the recognition of the fact that countries have since, we've moved beyond, being hewers of wood and drawers of water that countries were under when those structures were put in place back post the Second World War. So essentially, that's the kind of the long history. But I think just to conclude with this, 10 years ago, particularly during the culmination of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, I think civil society and many global south countries saw the need for us to press for a change in the global, basically the international financial architecture, to allow us to be able to optimize our capacity to raise resources to fund the Sustainable Development Goals. And so 10 years into the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, here we are still trying to figure out a way to correct the wrongs of the last 80 years to ensure that we're able to fund our development and move our population into the 21st century. So that's just a bit about the background to where we are today.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think it's very interesting to hear that perspective of what global tax governance has really looked like, what the entire process has also looked like in terms of how the financial architecture has been designed all the way from, let's say, the 1960s until today. And we can see clearly that there's so many changes that are coming up in terms of conversations around sustainable development, conversations around revenue, mobilization, and even just how we are pushing for our various development priorities. And this is very much focused on how we govern our tax systems, how we ensure that they're working for our people. And Riva, I just want to come to you as well and looking at how we've had a very interesting journey since 2024 pushing for this particular UN tax convention and thinking critically about how it's going to work for the global south and the different countries. What are your overall perspectives about it, and how would you want people to understand this process?
Sure. Thanks, Lorraine. Just to build on what Kwesi said, uh, that this unfairness in terms of global finances and the financial architecture is not just a tax question. It's a debt question. It's a trade question. It's in many other forms of multilateralism. And the fight has been ongoing. We can trace it from slavery to colonialism to neocolonialism. We are in the process of beyond decolonization, going into decoloniality, and which is basically dismantling the structures that endure from colonialism. So just the way Kwesi said that a lot of these instruments and frameworks were set up during colonialism, they still persist. And so the question that this UN tax convention is trying to address is how do we get our fair share of taxes, and how do we tax multinationals fairly, like relative to their economic activities. And so these are big questions, and the task is how do we put that in convention language. There are a lot of technical means for doing that. Wealthy people, for example, don't hold wealth as individuals. They hold it as companies, behind companies, behind companies. So how do you unveil, the corporate veil? How do you reveal who is really profiting from a company that is set up in an offshore jurisdiction and a low tax secrecy jurisdiction? How do we reveal all these, and how do we set up all the mechanisms that are going to rebalance and reallocate how countries tax people, individuals and corporates on as fair a basis as possible? So that's what the negotiations about. And what's difficult about them is it's not like many conventions that are at the UN, which are that begin with principles and have very clear articles that people understand. This is not your average human rights convention. It is a tax convention that is intended to realize human rights, that is intended to realize the sustainable goals. So I find that the negotiations have been challenging in that sense, because not only are you translating or trying to operationalize principles into a convention, but you're also dealing with power symmetries within negotiations. So, of course, those who have, high-income countries, OECD in particular, who have had the policies, who have been leading the policies around tax governance, want to maintain a status quo. And so a lot of the discussions are around maintaining what is. There's a lot of references to existing mechanisms, even if that was already agreed that this would be discussed at some point. Instead of trying to further the language and put flesh into what articles could have to operationalize the reallocation of taxing rights. We just heard a lot of the same. Let's keep what is. How does this work with what is? So, yeah, that's the challenge that we're facing.
Okay, that's very interesting to hear. I think I'll just turn to the audience and say that you can hear so many things coming from Riva's conversation, all the way from what power balancing looks like in this entire conversation to what human rights look like when they intersect with tax systems. Even beyond that is the question of equity, equality, and redistribution. What does it look like in this entire conversation? And even for you who's listening, it would be interesting to hear your various perspectives on what this looks like for your respective countries, because that's one of the most interesting conversations we're having. And just to try and link the conversation that Riva is having and coming to you, Alan, you've been coordinating a lot of conversations around tax justice for quite some time now and have also been the focal point of the Financing for Development Children and Youth constituency. So, my question to you is this entire process of coming up with the UN Tax Convention, what does it mean for the people? What does it mean for the citizens? What does it mean for the various constituents that you deal with?
Thank you, Lurit. I think it's very simple. We are at a time where we are responding to various I will call them challenges or crises or whichever way you look at it. From here in Africa, we're looking at issues of unemployment, of forced immigration, of peace and security. You go to Europe, you're finding affordability issues, you're finding student debt, you basically there's quite a lot that is happening because states are not being able to deliver on their core mandate, providing certain services or certain environments where people can thrive, where people can and if you look, for example, even in the US, even where in the global north, where someone will say, but I work 3 jobs, but I can't pay rent, I can't, I choose between medication and food or something like that. So I think we're at a point where we are facing multiple crises, and whether it's climate induced challenges in whichever country you could think about, small islands, countries, and all that. So and all those challenges, if you look at them, and that what River was talking about, is that they stem from a fact that states, whichever state you look at right now, are not really doing what they're supposed to do to facilitate people having livelihoods that they're supposed to have in a century or in a time where we've seen the most wealth created, where we've seen the most prosperity created, where we've seen the best technology created. So the question would be that with all that advance, why are we still not being able to afford basic life as young people? You don't have a job, you can't afford a meal, education, you're in debt. So, and when this conversation then comes in, then the question is, and it would also came in when we're doing advocacy around budget advocacy, especially me where I came from. You'd go and say, we need resources in this, we need resources in this. Then governments will say, we have infinite demands. The resources are finite. They are very limited resources. How are we supposed then to put them everywhere so that everyone benefits? So then it meant that we had to look at the side of how then do we get more resources? Where is this money that everyone is looking for? If you look at the dominant, for example, conversation that was dominant in the US election was issues of debt, issues of affordability, the economy. When we come to Kenya here, we had issues around the finance bills. Every time you feel the government in your pockets, the question is, how is it that I'm feeling it on the side of taking away and not it may be reducing on some of the challenges or working on some of the challenges that we're having. So it came to that the question then became, where are all these resources? How is it that, and well, maybe what I would like to add on the global side is that when this conversation started, it was meant to look like it's only countries in the global south that are losing money due to some of these illicit financial flows, tax havens, and all that. True, we lose the most, but even our counterparts in the global north realize that you're having billionaires, but the money is not coming in like the way it's supposed to be. Even though for them they benefited from systems like slavery, like colonialism, and all that. But even them now, they're having the same challenge. And they are the same perpetrators. They are the same companies that are polluting. They are the same companies that are um, benefiting from tax havens. They're the same companies. If you look at who is mining where and not paying their fair share, most of, especially they are the same companies. And I was seeing something recently. One of congresswoman from the US was attributing 40% of the growth of their economy to just 7 companies. So in the books, you're saying um, we're having economic growth in our countries. They are seeing 6%, 7%. But in actual sense, if you look at your sort of quality of life, it hasn't changed. Actually, it's becoming worse. So I think that's then where different constituencies are coming in, different young people, whether you're dealing with student debt in Europe, whether you're dealing with unemployment here in South Africa, whether you're dealing with forced immigration in the Sahel, and whichever problem young people are dealing with, I think we can be able to connect that problem to states being able to require resources to finance and invest in sectors that are critical to our well-being and us developing our livelihood. So it became a conversation that we could not avoid anymore, because every time we would say we need money, the question would be, where is the money? So with a lot of work that has been ongoing, we've identified that actually there are resources. We are not getting them because some countries have either become tax havens or they've facilitated multi-corporations not to be able to pay their fair share of tax, or that there are systems that we inherited that initially were extractive systems. We just took over them as countries, and then they still perpetuate the same sort of problem that we're having. So what is then happening is that then we say we need to have a look at this whole system. And the idea is that anyway, they are the same perpetrators, we are the same victims in every circumstance. So we had to come on board and see how we can be able to have this conversation and see how we can then change the rules that govern taxation, basically, or govern revenue mobilization at this level. Yeah, so that's how I would say that. That's how we are connected in all this. We are the victims, and they are the same perpetrators. So we have to have our voice on this table.
Okay. I think I find something very interesting in the 3 of your various contributions to this conversation, and is that we're moving from a system that has been very extractive for a very long period of time, and we're trying to get into a system that actually works for everybody. And the real reason is because we face the same problems. And the problems are actually hurting our fiscal space to a point where we cannot meet critical demands that either contribute to human development, contribute to national development, and even just contribute to financial development in general. And this is intersecting with critical issues that are happening right now, from the debt crisis to the climate crisis, and so many other intersecting issues that we need to think about. But very interesting in your conversation, Alan, the global south and the global north are actually facing similar problems. So it simply means that we actually have to find some kind of grounding to move from a system that does only works for one side and find one where each and every one of us is able to benefit from the entire system. Now, I want us to shift gears a little bit to what just happened over the last couple of days, and that is the 3rd intergovernmental negotiation sessions for the UN Tax Convention, which has actually happened in African soil for the first time. And before we even get into the nitty gritties, I just want to hear what was the most interesting part of these negotiations for you. I don't know who exactly to start with, but I'm thinking of picking Riva first and then
Ladies
Kwesi.
first.
We can do ladies first. So, Riva, tell us what has been interesting for you from this process and why?
I think I'm still processing what's happened. I think so much happened. I'm not sure what to be my takeaways. I mean, definitely what was frustrating was the unnecessary complication. Someone shared a joke and said, in Germany, we have a joke that says, "Why make things simple when you can complicate things?" And I think that
Yes.
just sums up everything. It sums up the tax process. It sums up, all these negotiations with accreditors and international financial institutions. They like to keep things high level. That's something that we kept hearing, like, let's keep this high level, let's keep these high level principles, let's deal with that in protocols, let's and so if we're just keeping things high level, we'll end up with this skeleton, a non-meaningful, non-operational convention that does nothing. And I think, uh, I think my biggest takeaway was that frustration. I think Alan said it very very clearly. These things are very clear. They're very, you know,
Yeah.
easy to see. Like, the solutions are here. Let's just allocate taxing rights. Let's cooperate all together. Let's be transparent about, let's share information, share data. It's, I mean, I think to everyone it seems very obvious, but somehow at the negotiations, we just got tied up in technicalities and, calls for high level principles. Yeah, for me that was my biggest takeaway and frustration.
Okay, Kwesi, how
Well,
about you?
so for me, quite a number of things, but I'll try and stick to one. But just to hark back to the earlier segment of our conversation, I mean, remember that we're dealing with, as I think Alan or Riva said, we're dealing with power asymmetry. Essentially, we're trying to reorder. And the thing is that there's been a group that's been the dominant force all around all these centuries. And so for me, going into the conversation, it was obvious that there'll be a lot of resistance and pushback. And of course, as expected, that was not disappointing. But for me, what really I thought stood out was the united front that Africa presented. I mean, we had by far the largest representation from the continent, and they spoke with a single voice, and they pushed back each time. And not only that, they spoke calmly, they spoke intelligently, and they negotiated. I mean, unlike any other forum we've seen. And that for me, I think it's my takeaway that Africa remains united around this fight. And I think that we definitely would win this fight. There is no way any other group can kind of dissuade us from our position. And I think it's only fair to, and I'm not trying to moralize this, but I think that Africa has been shortchanged for far too long. I mean, the extractivism that Alan talked about, inherently, people are scheming to continue to extract from here without contributing their fair share to the continent's development. I think that we've come to an era where we say we're not going to take that anymore. And I think the Africa group really represented us really well. I mean, not a single group anywhere in the world came together as the Africa group. And so I think that our negotiators are doing a good job. And I just hope that our governments, our capitals will continue to give them the support they need. And then also, of course, the support that civil society has been providing would remain available so that, our negotiators can get the best deal we possibly can secure from. This obviously is going to be a long drawn out, and I'm not under any illusion that this fight is going to be, a walk in a park. It's going to be a big fight. Also because the context is particularly important. We're seeing a shift and a certain emergence of multipolarity. And so there's a redistribution of not just simply economic, but also political power. And this puzzle fits perfectly into it. And so the resistance is going to come. And so the united front presented by our negotiators is absolutely necessary. And I think we need more of that. And we need more of a few countries were absent. I think we need all African countries to be represented in the room come February when we move to the next phase of the negotiations.
Okay, very interesting. Alan, do you share the same sentiment?
Yeah, actually, I think basically most of what I thought I would say has been said, and maybe to just build on the expectation that there would be resistance. I think it's something that the African group prepared for, the African civil society prepared for. If you remember, during the terms of reference, almost the entire EU abstained, so they weren't for, they weren't against, and that was because they didn't get most of the things that they had wanted to get within the system. And again, like Kwesi said, for them, the system still works as they intend to. River said we still have references and we had them, existing mechanisms. Let us make this more efficient and more effective, and the question is who has been making it not to be efficient and effective. Yeah, but I think for me, to add on what has been said, is having a framework, that a convention that we can actually also link to the very many things that have been happening. And it was, for me, what was very interesting is that it was happening as COP was also happening in Belem. And basically we're having the same conversation, two faces of the same coin. As people in Belem were discussing climate finance, doing away with promises that, are on the whims of certain individuals and the goodwill and the magnanimity of certain countries. We were here discussing the potential solutions. We don't have to wait for people to commit certain resources. We don't have to be at the mercy of a certain country saying, this year I'm in this process. Next year, when they get a new administration, they are not in the process. The other year, when another administration comes, and those are countries that you're looking at for leadership and all that. So I think that by these processes also happening at the same time, I think it was sort of, I don't know if it's symbolic or if it was now coming to the realities of our time, that almost all our issues, I think now it's becoming more in focus that they are related. And for me, I think the big takeaway is that we also, for the constituents where I've come from, that we had more stakeholders coming in to also engage. Initially, when you look at one of the contentious issues around capacity building, if you looked at the people that were in the room, there was so much capacity from civil society, academia, young people, activists. And they were giving the support that the countries needed to do the work that is supposed to be done during this process. So for me, I think that's indicative. And of course, when discussions were around it being so expensive, for example, to have all these negotiations in New York, one of the most expensive cities in the world. And it came and countries were like, okay, so we could have, there are different UN campuses or UN headquarters in different continents. Why don't we democratize that sort of process? And we've seen it that for the first time we have more civil society participating, more young people participating, more think tanks, more countries themselves participating. And we believe, like Kwesi said, if we maintain the course, I think we will get where we want to get to. It may take time. Of course, there's going to be pushback, but at least we know what is at stake. We know, of course, for us, we want to look at this as a life or death matter. I was telling someone that for us in the tropics, we have almost everything handed to us. The sun is good, the
Soil
water is there, and all that, yes. But for a country where they won't get their coltan to power their batteries in winter, they die. So for them, it's a life and death matter. They have to extract all the value they can. If they don't, they die. Literally, they die. So I think even as those should be the states, those should be the stakes that we need to get resources. It cannot be for a few people to prosper in a century where there is abundance of everything. So yeah, I think I'm hopeful. I think I'm hopeful for the process. It may take time, but systems change takes time. So yes.
Can I also say I'm hopeful?
Yeah.
No, because I shared frustrations and you shared hope and you shared hope, so I'm also hopeful. I mean, because we've been in the space since before, there was a UN tax, and we just, we were saying, yeah, UN tax body, global tax body now, and at the time it was very much a pipe dream. It didn't seem real, and even now it doesn't seem real that this is happening. So like even as it's like a marathon. Like even as you win some, you lose some, and it evolves over time. I think the biggest encouraging thing is that it's actually happening.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't want you to withdraw that, because I mean it was frustrating,
Okay.
particularly because, for example, the UN has defined what IFF is. The World Bank has defined it. IMF has defined. African
OECD.
Union has defined what IFF is, and you
Yeah.
had some of the northern negotiators asking
What are IFFs?
I mean,
Yes.
you can see that for some, it was just a deliberate effort to frustrate the process. And so I come back to the thing that, of course, that phase of the conversation was very disturbing, given that this is supposed to be a serious space for serious negotiations. But I think the global south, negotiators, the Africa group, India, China, Bangladesh, all took it in their stride. And I think that they responded really, again, I think the response was tough, but then also they kept us on track. So they were not distracted. And I thought that was smart. They did not fall, because that was a trap to get into a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And basically they scattered around that. And I thought that was a smart move. But I think for me, frankly, I think that we're on track. And I'm looking forward to February, the next round of the negotiations. I think we can expect more fireworks, given what we've seen in Nairobi.
Yes.
Okay. Kwesi, I can hear you talking about February. What's happening in February?
Well, in February, we'll have the fourth round of negotiations. And so on December 5th, countries and all stakeholders are expected to submit their thoughts, their positions on the convention as well as workstream 3. And then we would have to revisit a full session of the negotiations in February, basically a continuation of where we've left off in Nairobi. So yeah, and remember the deadline is for us to come up with a convention is 2027. So we don't have a lot of time left. So that's why so that's essentially what's going to happen in February. It's not going to happen in Nairobi. It's going to happen in New York, the most expensive city. But yeah.
Okay. And River, we're heading into that new phase of negotiations coming up next year. How do you think we should prepare for it?
I think there's so many ways. I know some of us are deliberately, directly speaking to our representatives, making submissions or asking them to make submissions around the convention, but then even as civil society coming up with our own. We did make one, but there's still room to elaborate on it and make it more robust. There's also just kind of popularizing and simplifying the message so people understand, like, Alan has been doing what tax means. I think it's become. I think budget issues and finance have become a lot more popular um, in public spaces, and so it's just getting more people interested, invested, and it's that kind of interest that brings negotiations to Africa. It's that kind of interest that allows civil society to be in the room. That allows greater participation, greater transparency, and also just dovetailing and interacting with the different processes. We brought these issues up at the fourth Financing for Development Forum in Sevilla this year. There were interrelated, conversations between the tax negotiations and COP. These are all intersecting, interrelated causes. Taxes finance everything, including climate finance. So we need to all be united. So I think there's a broad array of ways that we can continue to invest in our collective future.
Yeah. So Alan, I'm now moving on to you, and as we head into 2026 for really the next phase of negotiations, what do you want to see out of that process?
Well, I think, of course, is to maintain the momentum. I think, like Kwesi and River have said, we now just need to keep the foot on the gas. I think that's what I can say. And to do this, we'll have to keep this conversation in all spheres of public life. Let me put it that way, because it's one thing to, for example, to go for an AU meeting on peace and we say monies that would have been put to invest in technology, for example, in our economies, to invest in education and all that. We are using it, for example, to buy arms. But who are we protecting ourselves from? Who are we So it's taking away. So I believe we can have or connect the nexuses and the linkages to almost every sphere of life, so that our negotiators, our governments, our politicians, wherever they are, they see and hear the same message. And I think that's what got us to where we are right now. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, issues of illicit financial flows, issues of, aggressive tax avoidance and all those things, they were considered technical. But these days, even when you're discussing reforming malpratism, one of the antidotes, I'm talking, for example, the G20, when they're talking about, now these are conversations that now are coming up everywhere. You have to talk about the global financial architecture. You have to talk about how do we change, for example, the global debt architecture and all that. So the idea, I think, for me is to keep the momentum. And how we do that is that we have this conversation in every space that we are in, whether it's music, whether it's medicine, whether it's with peace and security. And for the simple reason, because if we fail on this side, none of those is going to really be able to amount to what we want it to be. You could look at the Millennium Development Goals. We had those goals, they came, they went away. Why? Resources. In 15 years, we told ourselves we would have, and even have an entire SDG 17 towards, partnerships for development and all that. So as we're talking about everything else development, I think we should be able, or we should be talking about why we need to have fair allocation of taxing rights, to have that sort of revenue, so that governments don't cut funding where they need to put it, so that governments have the resources they need. And especially in this era that we're in, to invest in sectors that are critical to human development. And you can imagine where, for example, we've been having a bad situation with unemployment, and then you have AI that is making it worse. So, but you're not investing in alternatives. You're not, where countries are talking about basic personal income, or, credit and all that. You can't do that because you don't have the resources to do that. So me, I think what I would want to see is that we maintain the momentum. I would also want to see more constituencies, more movements joining in. I'll give an example. When we were in the negotiation room, we realized, at least from the youth perspective, we didn't have youth from Latin America, we didn't have youth from Northern America, we didn't have youth from Asia. But are you saying that they are not facing the same challenges, the same problems that people in Europe and people in Africa are facing? So I think for me, that's the other thing I want to say. I want to see more people. We have to take back our power. I remember during when Kenyan youth were taking back their power, someone said something that was interesting. She said they had delegated their power for MPs to work for them. Since they didn't, they were going to come and do group work. And it reminded me when we were doing group work, and you contribute what you think should be the solution to the challenge that you've been given. I think I would like to see more young people, more movements, more trade unions, more everyone coming to do group work with our negotiators, so that we have a framework convention that works for all of us. Yeah.
Okay. More engagement with the negotiators. Interesting. So I'm about to bring this conversation to a close, but I have one interesting question for each of you. So you have an opportunity to tell your negotiator one thing, just one thing, to actually keep them motivated through this whole process. What would you tell them? Kwesi, should I start with you?
Well, so I mean, it's hard to choose, but I'll respond to your question shortly. But one of the things I think worth pointing out from this process is that when we speak as Africans together, for me, the room represented a Pan-African voice. When we work together, we're irresistible. I mean, nobody can push us back. And I'm raising this because I remember the COP in Durban, I think it was COP 11 or so, when, the famous principle, common but differentiated principles, were decimated essentially by a pushback from the global north, who simply wanted to abdicate their responsibility for having polluted, and destroyed essentially the climate. And now today we have pledge and review, essentially, which means it doesn't matter how much you've polluted historically, just do whatever you think you can. And countries that have contributed the least are having to shoulder more than their fair share. So essentially, we're just flipping the coin and saying, no, not anymore. We have to get our fair share of the taxes due us to fund, the mess that's been created by way of, climate change and underdevelopment. But I mean, I think one of the things is that I think the African negotiators have some red lines. I think those red lines are backed by empirical evidence. And I think, so for example, issues around, allocation of tax rights, issues of taxation of high net worth individuals, issues around illicit financial flows, um, tax avoidance and tax evasion, but then also mutual administrative assistance as well as capacity. I think they have some red lines that I think are backed by the empirics that they need to hold on to. But the last thing I think worth pointing out, if I have to speak to a negotiator, is that I think their position around, arbitration, it's great because, and I just cite you one example. Just a few years ago, Nigeria was slapped by a high court in London, actually a court in London, for I think $10 billion for a company that claimed to have invested $50 million in that country, a gas processing company. And they came back and said for the abrogation of the contract, they were due that much. And the court awarded them. Now, it was only when the Nigerian government proved that, one, it was a corrupt process they adopted, and it was full of fraudulent deals. It was only then that the High Court in London basically ruled against, basically reversed the ruling. Now, that cost that country a lot. And imagine if that award of $10 billion had stood, can you imagine the damage it would have done to an economy that is made up of 235 million people?
It's a lot.
I mean, that is how terrible, arbitration is. And because often it happens in the global north, it serves the interest of the global north countries because the arbitrations don't happen in Nairobi or in Accra. It will either be in London, Paris, or New York. So I think we need to learn from our evidence. Arbitration is off the table. I think all the other options are worth considering. Arbitration,
And what are
and I
these
think,
options?
and our negotiators were clear in that. And I think that I would say let's stick to our goals, our red lines, and not giving. Yeah.
Okay. Who goes next? Alan?
River.
Alan? River?
I was going to say what he said.
I'm sorry.
Basically, what he said. I mean, just everything that he said, same, ditto. No, I mean, just in a nutshell, that there's there's only so much inequality that is acceptable. Sure, we will always be unequal, but at some point, it's just obscene. We're coming up to having our first dollar trillionaire, and when you try to represent this. Forgive my example in rice, I'm Asian, but like someone tried to represent it in terms of jars of rice, and it was like 100 jars of rice relative to, a pinch. That's what a trillion looks like. And inequality is not just, it's not just bad for, inadequate public services, inadequate resources, but it also skews power even more. And we see more and more billionaires taking political positions. We see rising authoritarianism to able to keep power, and it skews everything. And so, I mean, my last point would just be that this is our collective planet. This is our collective resources. This is we are in this earth together, and yeah, we need to make it work for everyone. There's no need to have that level of obscene wealth,
Yeah.
which is happening through avoidance and evasion, and yeah.
Okay, Alan, it's your turn now.
If I was to, I think, I think, like I said, for me, first to talk to our negotiators, is to say that yes, we should keep the leadership. I think Christy talked about it. We have to remember that from the General Assembly, from the resolution that actually brought us to this process, most countries were, especially those in the global north, were opposed. They didn't vote for this, but it passed anyway because we were united. We started the negotiations around the terms of reference, certain things like decision making, even the decision actually to have to negotiate two protocols at the same time as negotiating a convention. It was basically to derail the process, but of course, uh, because of the red lines that Chrissy talked about, we had to say, okay, we'll have the convention, but also have these other sort of protocols. And one of the other protocols that were mainstream or was being pushed around, the one on disputes, we saw how the conversations around that went. But I think to our negotiators, I think we should keep the leadership. I think a lot of things have happened because the African group has said or not said things, or has done or not done things. I think um, um, we need to maintain that leadership, but also we can also commit to our negotiators, that us from our constituencies, as young people, as trade unions, as civil society, as this, that we are going to give them the support that they need when we can. Because I think most of the times, if we saw in the negotiations where the discussion was going haywire, and then civil society comes in, and then we sort of bring them back and all that. Yeah, and where there's need also for political will, I think we are going to manufacture it. We don't have to ask for it. Yes, so that they do their jobs. Of course, why I'm saying this is that negotiations are a bit different. When we go to our countries, most of the times we're at loggerheads with our governments. They are doing very many things we do not like, and at home we may be called antagonistic, we may be called all those other things. But when we're negotiating a once in a generation, a once in a lifetime sort of framework, I think we put aside most of those things that we disagree on at home, and say that we're going to give them the support that they need to see this through. And that's why I'm saying, for the political, we'll have to manufacture it. We won't ask for it. We will keep this conversation in the phases where it's supposed to be, and then hopefully we'll get a convention that rewrite some of the historical wrongs, but also gives us a future that we are not worried about leaving our children. I always said that we should see tax justice in our lifetime. We're not yet there, but I think we've moved some way.
We're almost there.
Yeah, we should.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, let them keep the leadership, and then we will offer them the support that we can within this process.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what I can say.
I think it's been wonderful to listen to each and every one of you. And as we keep negotiating, there are very interesting concepts that keep coming up. And I think this is really just to the audience as well. When you're trying to understand this entire process, it would be critical to look back at those critical concepts that are coming up in this conversation. For example, taxing high net worth individuals, which you've had a lot from Riva, thinking a lot about ending harmful tax practices, which really matter for conversations around human rights, cost of living, and any other elements that we're thinking about.